Okay. Thank you again for joining a episode of Real Rebellious Research. We are talking about research within the generations today, and we have Walker Post here, who's just done a huge research study, which he'll talk more about, and is also between two generations. So we're going to learn a little bit about what it's like to have one foot in two different boats. But so we're going to hear a little bit more about this. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really, really excited to hear, how we're different, how we're the same, and everything else. But Walker, can you give us a little introduction on yourself, the organization behind this research, and kind of what began this journey?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Elizabeth. I'm excited to be here today and speak to the Real Rebellious Research fandom. So my name is Walker Post. I am calling in from New York. I am the Associate Director of Strategy at Do Something Strategic, where I help a global list of clients through data-driven research, people-centered storytelling, and bespoke strategies to help foster community impact and behavioral change. And so Do Something is a community of change makers. We're the leading hub for youth-centered activism and service with over 1 million active members. So we've been around since 1993. So we just celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. We've mobilized over 8 million young people, which we define as 13 to 25, in every US area code and 189 countries. So for these individuals, for these 8 million young people, we're an action platform for them. And so we help activate them through SMS, through our digital first website. And we approach and meet the needs of young people where they are and leverage peer-to-peer technology to scale their impact on the issues that matter most to them. And so I actually sit on the Do Something Strategic consultancy side. And so my team, which is the in-house consultancy, supports brands in developing youth engagement strategies by drawing upon our data, insights, and the ability to co-create change alongside Do Something members. And so that's a little bit about Do Something. And then outside of that, I'm the founder of my own nonprofit, Covalent, which is a global digital marketing fellowship program that's trained over 130 students while providing pro bono support to 80 plus small businesses and nonprofits on digital marketing and fundraising projects. And so I've worked with a wide range of young people, stakeholders and brands, including Hinge, Teach for America, American Red Cross, Serious Fund Children's Network, United Way, and many more. And I'm happy to tell you more about how we got into this research.
Yeah, so, okay, great intro. How did you get into this research? And I think the other question is there a lot of research in this area of looking at the difference in generations, or is there research that maybe was done in the past that didn't include our younger generations now?
Sure. So I would say there's not a lot of research out there on where Gen Z sees brands meeting their expectations pertaining to the social issues that matter to them, and the employee engagement practices that are important to them. And so there was a lot of white space. But before we get into that, I'll back up for a second. We approached our research and this work with the hypothesis and the belief that Gen Z, both as consumers and as employees, hold brands to a really high standard as change-making engines for good. And so our question was, can brands live up to these high expectations? And what are their own expectations? And what's like the grade that they're giving themselves for their own work in social impact and employee engagement? And so we surveyed nearly 1,200 young people and 100 plus brands to find out. So we published part one of our report, What Gen Z Wants, Brands and Social Impact, in February, and we're publishing part two next week. And so what we found and what we're highlighting is the disparity between Gen Z's expectations and how brands perceive their own efforts. And just at a high level, bird's eye view, our research found that Gen Z perceives brands as overly optimistic regarding their social impact efforts. So 15%, 58% of the professionals that we surveyed, they said that their brand is meeting or exceeding their expectations to demonstrate their commitment to social impact and corporate citizenship. So that's, a lot of pats on the backs. but only 15% of Gen Z said that brands were meeting their expectations. And so you have 58% on one side and you have 15% on the other. Huge disparity that we wanted to unpack more. And we've had, a lot of interesting conversations about that, and we can sort of explore and talk more about why that is and sort of why we explored this research even further.
Yeah. No, I think that's fascinating. And I mean, you also have to put in the fact that, with some of these brands making commitments for 2050 to do the right thing, when you have people who are who haven't spent that much time on the earth yet to say we're gonna wait more time than you've been alive to fix this, you could see why there would be some impatience in there. And I share that impatience as well. So you're between two generations. You're kind of in between a millennial and a Gen Z. And can you explain, because I'm also in between two generations, but the older side of that, I'm between Gen X and a millennial. So explain to me, what are the differences between millennials and Gen Zs? And I think some of us also confuse the two sometimes. I think sometimes we blame one for the other when we think millennials are still these young kids running around, and they're actually all in the workforce and very much more of a slower lifestyle than what people think. But
yeah, so I'm happy to share the distinctions. And so what we think about when we think of millennials is anyone born between 1981 and 1996. And anyone born from 1997 onward is part of Gen Z. And so myself, I was born in the mid 90s and 96, if anyone cares to know specifically. So I'm on the cusp right there. And I'd spent my whole life with the term millennial hurled at me like it was derogatory slang. And I proudly wore the millennial badge with honor. And then one day, someone started telling me I was Gen Z, and I was shocked and defensive. And I was like, Gen Z, what is Gen Z? And the more I learned about them, the more I realized, how different really is the millennial from the Gen Z. And I'm kind of stuck in this no man's land, a millennial born close enough to Gen Z to have picked up some of the tendencies, a zillennial, if you will. But I believe it's given me a unique lens to see the world through two different generations. And so going back now to what is a millennial, they were considered and are considered a diverse, generally socially progressive generation. They remember where they were when 9/11 happened. They remember life without smartphones and came of age alongside the internet boom. They burned CDs for their crushes on their parents' old desktops. Maybe that was just me. They witnessed the emergence of YouTube, and they were the MySpace and Facebook pioneers back when those platforms were relevant. So their digital footprint, they were only starting to take shape on these platforms before the tech industry created social media as we know it now. And so Gen Z now is the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in the US that we've seen, and they're very socially progressive. They don't remember 9/11, but COVID-19 came at a really crucial time for them personally, professionally, and developmentally. It's likely the most notable life event that they've lived through, and most have had smartphones in their hands by their early teens, became mass consumers of whatever Silicon Valley decided to put in front of them. So they've lived through the formative years of Instagram's rise to relevance, and most recently TikTok. These digital natives really understand technology better than millennials and Gen X and beyond, but they are growing weary of it. Many are seeing this now as a curse rather than a blessing. And so all of this to say, the millennials and the Gen Zs are not drastically different, but I do think that since social media took off in the 2010s, we've seen some troubling statistics with teen depression up, teens committing self-harm up, and political polarization by algorithms that have really broken us apart, causing us to feel lonelier than ever. So while millennials experience some of this, Gen Z has really had to live with it. And so, I've seen firsthand the effects of growing up in the smartphone world and how it impacts both generations. but it's really hit Gen Z hard. And so that is something that they're reckoning with right now. They're making their voices heard. And that's part of why this research is so important, is because they've had enough, and they're letting brands know.
Yeah. Interesting that you talk about them sort of becoming wary of the technology industry and being so connected to technology. Where do you see this going down the line from that?
There's a lot of conversation right now about like Y2K nostalgia and Gen Z feeling reminiscent of times that they did not yet experience, almost as, and I'll speak to this more a little bit later in the interview, but it's this concept anemoia, which is nostalgia for a time that you have not experienced or a place that you have not experienced. And I think some of them are feeling that towards the 90s and the early 2000s, when there were no smartphones and you were fully in the presence of others around you and not so much glued to the thing that you have right here, which never leaves your side at any point in the day. And so I think there's a bit of a rebellion in some ways of Gen Z wanting to take back their personal time, get off of their phones and get back in person. And, we've been doing work around that with some of our clients that do something strategic, tackling the loneliness epidemic. And it's been really fascinating to explore and hear from young people that they're fed up with their phones and they're ready to, get back to being, human again and spending time with one another.
I think that's so interesting and refreshing, because from what I've heard, I think there's this huge misconception that Gen Z loves their phone so much, and oh, why can't you put your phone down and meet somebody at a bar like we all did, and this kind of thing. So I think that's a really interesting part of this, and also very a hopeful part of this as well, because we know Gen Z is pushing a lot of important initiatives and is a very large and influential generation. So or will be as time goes on. But let's talk about this a little bit more. When you talked about businesses that were that Gen Z had a reaction to, or what are the benefits businesses can gain from aligning their brand with social impact? And I don't mean that they say that they're sustainable or that they care about diversity. Like, when you're really talking about hitting the hearts of this generation that does want to do a lot of change for the world, and maybe it's important to say first, this is something that we've seen in all generations, right? We saw the baby boomers do amazing things for women's rights and different aspects of empowering young men not to be pulled into wars that they didn't believe in, or to serve their country in a different way. But we see the generations all have kind of their different initiatives, and we all need to push it forward, and the young show us that we're not done, right? And we get to keep feeling young because of that, and doing that. But talk about this, when you talk about brands, you mentioned that brands thought that they were doing a good job, and the young didn't agree. Can you give me an example of a brand doing a good job and really hitting the hearts of Gen Z, and what does this mean?
Sure. Well, I think for young people, they want to feel good about where they shop, full stop. They are voting, but they're also voting with their credit card when they decide where they're going to, spend their money. And so a brand that's been doing a good job, I'm actually relatively new to this brand. And so they've been around for a while. I don't know if you're familiar with Veja, the shoe brand. They have an amazing commitment to traceability, detailing the origins of like their production and their supply chain, sourced from Amazon rainforest. Their shoes are 62% bio-based and recyclable, and they're all about fair trade practices and ensuring fair wages for all of their workers. But their partnerships are also really special. And so they've partnered with a nonprofit, I believe it's a French nonprofit, coordinating that their product logistics. So they hire vulnerable, disabled, and sometimes socially excluded people to run their logistics. And so they've helped nearly 300 people find jobs and stability through that program. They also host a run club in New York City led by formerly incarcerated people through another partnership. And so this is an amazing example of a brand that's not only doing what they can from, supply chain and sustainable product standpoint, as they call it, regenerative work and regenerative business model, but they're also, committed to fair labor practices. They have the right partnerships in place. And so from top to bottom, this is a brand that is doing amazing work. And they are clear that they're not making as much money because they are so intentional about the materials that they use. But that's part of their brand and part of their essence. And so for people that can get behind this brand, it makes a lot of sense. And I'll give a shout out to my boss who was wearing Behas in the office the other day. So it's working.
And what generation is your boss? No, don't need to name any names.
He's a millennial.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. And more of a millennial on my side or on your side? Is that
on your side? On your side.
Really? All right. Okay. I'm going to check out my my Vejas situation. Are there brands that the Gen Z are actively not? Are they voting where they're excluding their paycheck or their wallets from that? Is there also that going on?
Yeah, I won't name particular brands right now, but it's difficult. It's difficult to do the right thing in this society because I think brands are scared to put their name out there, sometimes with a social cause, and they're worried of the blowback from stakeholders, whether that's their board, their workforce, or their consumers. But Gen Z is saying, like, we want to see you show up, but you have to show up authentically. And so if you're championing causes that you don't really have any business championing and it feels fake, they're going to call that out. We saw a lot of that after 2020. A lot of brands made a lot of big promises, and a lot of those promises were not met. Almost 5 years later, we're seeing the pendulum swing back the other way with some of these brands who have decided this was more performative than actually, than it should have. I think they led people on. And so I think Gen Z sees through that. They're quick to call it out. And in the world of social media, that can spread like wildfire. So, I think it is, for some brands, a scary game, but Gen Z wants to see you stick up for something that feels authentic.
So when we're talking about the workplace, because one of the things that you mentioned was that COVID was a very influential time. And of course, it would be for people who are younger in the workforce, possibly at the beginning of their career or at a crucial time there. Why is it important to design the workplace to meet the needs of young people? And I'm going to include the two youngest generations in that, and then we can go to the older ones.
Sure.
But yeah.
Well, in our research, we found that what Gen Z wants as it relates to employee engagement practices maps to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so if you think about a pyramid, and at the bottom, you've got physiological needs, then you've got safety and security, love and belonging, self-esteem, and then self-actualization at the very top. The things that they wanted, that was work-life balance, competitive salary and financial benefits, and physical and mental wellness programs. Those are really aligned with this idea about balance, being compensated fairly, being secure in that, and having options to ensure that their mind and body are taken care of. And so companies can start there. As it relates to compensation, can you offer stock options? Can you offer equitable pay? Can you offer bonuses? Balance, can a young person work remotely? Can they have flexibility in their hours? Can they take a personal day if something comes up? And then on the mind and body front, are you offering mental health solutions, gym memberships, good healthcare plans, and does the work environment feel comfortable in a safe space for these people to show up as themselves? The other thing that they want is that they want more third spaces. As I was talking about this loneliness epidemic, they're trying to they've missed out on some really, really critical years, whether it was in high school or in college, where they missed graduation or they took their classes for a year online. And so they missed out on some key opportunities to develop social skills and to develop their networks further. And so brands need to be creating environments either in the office or after work for colleagues to bond. It's important for this cohort that lost their formative years of developing social bonds thanks to this pandemic. The last thing I will say, and I will credit Seth Godin for this, who surveyed 10,000 people in 90 countries. And he asked them what the best jobs included. And the three things that he heard them say overwhelmingly was, 1, I accomplished more than I thought I could. 2, I worked with some amazing people. And 3, I found purpose and meaning. And I think the purpose and meaning is really important here. How can you give your employees something to work on that feels bigger than themselves? And oftentimes, one of the best ways to do that is to create a social impact platform within your own company so that young people can contribute, whether it's volunteering, working and mentoring others, or maybe it's a social impact driven organization and that's built into the bottom line. These are some of the things that people said are the best jobs. And so I think we should not lose sight of that.
I love that. One of the things that comes up with some of the older generations, and it gets said, is because the millennials and the Gen Zs have both said they prefer mentorship over pay or work-life balance over pay. And there's a lot of things that they look at for happiness in a workplace over money, which especially in the United States is a bit of a conundrum because this is the generation with the biggest amount of student debt ever, right? Mm-hmm. So how explain this to older generations?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I would say our research would disagree with that point. I think young people are looking for competitive salary and financial benefits. I know that there is some debate on that, but we have a generation that is frustrated with the state of the world and unhappy with the cards they've been dealt. In the US, for the first time in history, 30-year-olds are no longer doing as well as their parents were financially. Home prices have skyrocketed and outpaced wages. And college debt is hitting young people hard, as you've said. And so they're being told to work harder and pay their dues and that the wealth will come. And these social issues that they care about will be resolved by, say, 2050. They're hearing, don't worry, the adults have it under control. And young people aren't buying it and they're not backing down. And so they're focused on making their voices heard, and they're sharing their dissatisfaction with the workplace. And so, I think in, a society right now where things are so expensive, I live in New York City. This is one of the most expensive cities in the world. No one around me would tell you that pay is not important to them, but I recognize this is one small city in a large world. But I think that rings true for many young people. While they want mentorship and career development opportunities, they also want the opportunity to have, be able to put away money and eventually one day buy a home or retire. And the way that they're seeing the world play out, the older generations have all of the wealth and young people really have none of it. And so they have a right to be upset and they have a right to be compensated fairly.
I'm going to switch gears for a moment and say something that's rarely ever said. Can we talk about Gen X for a minute? The ignored middle child of the generations between the big boom and the little boom. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so Gen X is interesting. I think they have, our research does not focus too much on the Generation X, but they right now are the ones who are the leaders of the brands. They're the ones who are the hiring managers. They're the ones who have, I would say, had financial opportunities to grow and sort of cement themselves well in the world, and have a larger percentage of the wealth than the millennials and the Gen Z and Gen Alphas, which, we'll have to save the Gen Alpha conversation for another podcast, the new emerging generation. I think there's a discrepancy between, when Generation X was growing up, there was very little conversation on what is your company doing to improve the world. You went into your work, you got your money, and you left. It wasn't about like, what are the mental health supports that this company offers. It wasn't about what are the volunteer opportunities. I think the emergence of social impact as like a sector was barely beginning. And so I think there's a disconnect between how Generation X sees the role of brands in society and how millennials and how Gen Z sees it as, well, we're in a state where often politics are gridlocked. We're not seeing as much change as we would like. And so brands, there's a higher expectation on them to create change on their terms with their employees. And I think there's a discrepancy between how much brands should really be involved. And the young people are really championing the importance of it. And I think Generation X might not understand it or resonate with it as much.
Tell me about the benefits of working differently that you see, both with the younger generations and with the old fogies and like me. But
yeah, I think the idea of working differently, the benefits, one, I think people, as I've said, people want to feel good about where they shop, and 59% of Gen Z have made a purchase from a brand based on values. And our research also found that 76% of young people are actively looking for ways to help the causes that they care about. But 1/3 of them don't know where to begin. So that's 17 million young people. And so there's an opportunity to work differently alongside young people to make this change. And I think it's a huge opportunity for brands to engage them. Do you have any follow-up questions that relates to like what you mean by working differently? I'd love to unpack that a little bit more. I just want to make sure I'm answering your question.
No, I think you said it right. I think, the baby boomers really, they committed to their jobs for a very long time, and there's still many of them in the workforce now. I remember when I was in high school, they were talking about the baby boomers going to retire anytime now, and we're still saying that quite a number of years later. But from everything I know about the human brain, I'm not against working until you don't want to anymore. I think what you could do with the human brain in work is extraordinary, and when you stop using it, you start losing it. So I am a fan of that, and I look forward to doing things until I'm done. But we had the boomers really going in and like you said, plugging away, doing the job, all of that. Then we had Generation X, which was kind of waiting for their turn a bit. And I don't know if they've totally gotten it yet, but wanting to do things their way. But when the big joke, when COVID was kind of subsiding a bit and people were going back to the office, was the people who wanted to go back to the office were stale, male, pale, and Yale, right? Highly educated, old, white guys. And we've heard that that's not entirely true, but there's some truth to that. So when you talk about working differently, I think there's a lot of ideas about how the different generations want to work, and I've seen some of the TikTok videos of the different generations and how they want to work. But what do they actually want? What is kind of bad press, or and how are we similar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the future is hybrid work. I would say, though, as a young person, while working remotely and digital nomading, as they call it, which is essentially the idea that you can go and work in Portugal if you want and work on for a US company. with a headquarters in New York. I think there's a lot of romanticizing that. And I think for some people, it's an amazing opportunity. If you can do that, it's great. Gen Z is, a very global centric generation. And so that's amazing. But at the same time, I think overall, especially as a young person, having exposure to people in the office is a great thing, because I think you are developing your social skills, you're learning social cues, you're having the water cooler conversations with management, and you're getting yourself out there more. And I think in a world where we are so in front of our screens, innovation can happen I think a little bit easier in an in-person environment. And so I would say that the future is hybrid. I love the opportunity for myself. I go in 3 days a week, Mondays and Fridays, I work from home. It's a great balance for me. And I think that's important. But the idea that there needs to be some sort of return to office, I think resonates with me because of the socialization aspects for young people. And I think many individuals would agree. As you get older, you have children or you have other priorities, or maybe, for example, you might be neurodivergent and you might need more time focused without other people around you constantly interrupting your train of thought or your focus. There should be exceptions for that as well. And so I think, again, work-life balance and flexibility will be important. And we will see, there's a lot of conversation on this concept of the 4-day work week, which sounds lovely. I would love to be a guinea pig and see if that could work. I do think more companies will embrace that and try that, as they are trying to stand out in a really, really competitive, workforce market. And so people will be attracted to the idea of that sort of work-life balance. And so I'll be curious to see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, and if you've watched some of our past episodes, we did an episode on the 4-day work week with Joe and Jay, and that was an extraordinary episode where we learned Joe O'Connell got started researching the 4-day work week because he was researching working mothers who took a day off to take care of their kids, and he found out that their output was the same as their male counterparts who were working full time. So it is possible. And I think they work a lot with getting rid of some of the unnecessary, for instance, weekly meetings that all of us have that maybe are not as productive as we think they are. But I think the 4-day work week is certainly a huge opportunity, maybe not for someone's whole career, but for phases of a person's career, or doing more of a sprint and run scenario. But one of the things that you talked about, and I think this is really interesting, was the socialization of the younger generations. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily know what you mean by this, but when you put it into context of people missing high school or college, where you are finally on your own in important meetings where your parents are not there to kind of advocate for you, or stepping up or trying to represent yourself to someone high up in the company or at the university or whatever. Do you think, what can we do for this, and what can older generations help with? Because I mean, if you look at the baby boomers and Gen X, they had amazing experience with this. They would fly to another city to have a meeting anytime, right? They were very much, business was face to face. It was very human. It was very kind of personal, and also in the workplace there was a lot of that community and socialization. So yeah, can you speak to more of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there needs to be a balance, and flying out for a meeting is maybe not always the most productive use of your time. And so we've a lot of people would actually now prefer to meet with a client virtually, because you get time back in your day to focus on keeping your house in order, right? And so focusing on making sure that your boxes are checked, that your physical and mental wellness is secured. And so it is sort of a push and pull, right? There needs to be, ideally an in-person component to anyone's work, but at the same time, there is some benefit to having those hours back in your day if you don't need to fly across the country for a meeting. And so I think some of the changes that COVID brought upon us are for the better. It proved that we could work in a digital first world in a way that, we had never tried before as a world, as a society. And a lot of good came from that. And it's allowed actually for workers to take back some of their own autonomy in how they structure their own days. And so for people who are entirely remote, and that is the best thing for them, given their circumstances, it's really empowering, right? And they don't need to always find a job that's 100% in the office. We have fully remote workers at Do Something. And for some of them, it's amazing because they have other things that need to be taken care of in their life. Or they work in a different state and they want to be part of what we're building at Do Something. And it's amazing that we're able to have this hybrid workforce. And that also takes, some challenges and also brings opportunities when you're thinking about facilitation in a hybrid environment. It's required everyone to think more creatively about what it means to innovate, to brainstorm, and to host meetings where it's not just everyone in the room talking over those who are in Zoom land. And so, there's a lot of learning that still needs to be done. I don't think as a society we've completely figured out the best way to create hybrid workforces, but I think they are important.
Okay. So can we do a disaster scenario? Like, how do we screw up this whole thing?
Yeah, let's go to the doom and gloom for a second. So I think on a company level, what brands should be thinking about is if you're ignoring the expectations and the preferences of younger generations like the younger millennials and Gen Z, you may alienate them and, lose a significant consumer base with massive purchasing power and influence, massive. And failing to adapt to changing societal values and trends could leave your brand with reputational damage and a loss of market share. So that's the bottom line thing that many brands will think about. But at a societal level, I think Gen Z is stating the obvious. Climate change is here and needs addressing. We have a mental health crisis. We need to tackle the loneliness epidemic and address income inequality. I could go on. There's so many things. But the cards that the older generation have dealt them and younger millennials like myself, they're not a winning hand. And so issues will continue to get worse if companies don't step in and take on the issues that are relevant to their brand. And so to do something strategic, we disagree with, the notion that businesses need to stay out of the fight, which is maybe what the Gen Xers might argue. Not all of them, that's a bit of a stereotype, but brands have tremendous power to move the needle and should be co-creating solutions alongside young people. And so that's really what our work is based on. And it's really important. And so how do we screw it up? Ignoring what these young people have to say. Young people have always been outspoken, and now we are seeing it almost feels like we're at a breaking point. And so I think we need to be having better, smarter conversations and bringing them at the table, just not the kids' table.
All right. And the opposite of that, how do we look into the future?
So I think this is a great question, and I'm going to revisit one of those points that I shared with you earlier around this concept of anemoia, which again is this nostalgia for a place or time never known. There is a writer named Freya India who wrote an essay recently called A Time We Never Know, and it was published this year. And I will love to read you a short excerpt from it because I think it gets to your point and explains some of the things that are, I think, misconceptions of older generations of young people. So this part of the essay speaks to the concept of anemoia for the 90s. So there were hard times, of course. The 90s weren't all bliss, no era is, but the world we inhabit now is markedly different. New technologies cheapen and undermine every basic human value, Friendship, family, love, self-worth, all have been recast and commodified by the new digital world, by constant connectivity, by apps and algorithms, by increasing solitary platforms and video games. I watch these 90s videos and I have the overwhelming sense that something has been lost. Something communal, something joyous, something simple. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can give future generations a real world childhood. We can prioritize play. We can delay entry to social media platforms until at least 16. We can encourage young people to just hang out with each other without supervision and without smartphones. We can take elements of childhood from previous eras and reintroduce them in modern life. But we have to remember what has been lost. When we are grieving record stores, mixtapes, old school romance, and friends goofing around in 90s high schools, what are we actually grieving? Delayed gratification, deeper connection, play and fun, risk and thrill, life with less obsessive self-scrutiny. These are the things we can reclaim if we remember what they are worth and roll back the phone-based world that degraded them. We have to start somewhere. I suppose what I'm asking for here is some sympathy and a little more grace. It's easy to mock Gen Z and Gen Alpha for their soaring screen time, to roll your eyes at teenagers wasting their youth in their rooms, ruminating about themselves and feeling hopeless about the future. But they are trying their best to keep up with a world so agonizingly different from any before it. And it is the only one they have ever known. So please, next time you cringe at Gen Z for not coping, for not feeling cut out for this world, remember how painful it is to think that the good times are over. Then imagine how much more painful it would be to realize you never knew them.
Wow, I love that, and I love this concept. And the '90s were great, and I found a mixtape the other day with and the work that went into waiting until it popped up on the radio so I could record it. But I think what I'm hearing, if I listen to this, is I think the generations have some extremely different experiences in life, but also want similar things, maybe more passionately or more fiercely right now. And I think one of the things that we can do as older generations is really help the younger generations to find their way in the workplace, find their way in life, and help encourage, the technology-less scenarios of face-to-face communication, because I think we've all gotten worse at them. But I would love a little class on that as well. And I think embracing the younger passions of changing the way that we work. I think there's been some incredible things that have happened since we've let women who are young mothers work from home part-time or work 4 days a week. What we're seeing is return to office mandates. You're most likely to lose underrepresented races or religions or genders. So we need to kind of find a little way together. And I think that's usually the answer, right? Where we're not so different, but if we blend it just right, it might be perfect. So thank you so much for this discussion. It was incredibly illuminating. I did not know enough about Gen Z at all. I'm so happy that your company is representing and helping brands to kind of embrace positive change and talk about it and kind of normalize this idea of changing the world and doing some good. So well done you, and thank you so much for this conversation.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you for the thoughtful questions, and I do have a lot of hope for the future. And I think we can all work together to make sure that generations to come have something to look forward to. So thanks again for your time.
Thanks, Walker.
Bye, take care.